So basically, we're looking today at a watch that I didn't think I was going to buy, and that is a Quartz Grand Seiko. And I know it'll be divisive for a lot of people because the idea of luxury quartz and paying really over $500, even $200 in some people's cases for a quartz watch is kind of, unjustified for some people. But I think there's a lot of cool things about this watch and the movement in particular, and let's kind of get into that. So really quickly, just going over a very, very brief history of Grand Seiko. They were basically founded in 1960, and it was a competition between two factories, basically. It was Suwa Seikosha, which mainly produced Grand Seiko, and Dani Seikosha, which mainly produced King Seiko. Now, around 1968, they started getting more in line with only producing Grand Seiko in a sense, and Dani Seikosha actually did produce the 44 GS model, or the case model of Grand Seiko, of course, and that kind of became their most Grand Seiko exemplified kind of design. It was their new design language moving forward, their new case, their idea of having all perfectly geometric angles rather than a completely circular case with mirror polish finishing, no distortions, and such things as that. Digressing a little bit, 4 years after the start of Grand Seiko in 1964, they decided to test their watchmaking prowess, their accuracy in the Neuchâtel, probably butchering the pronunciation of that, but the Neuchâtel Observatory Trials in Switzerland. And in 1964, when they first entered, they placed 144th, which is fairly low. But over the next 3 years, they kept entering, re-entering, improving. And in 1967, they placed within the top 10, I believe. And in 1968, they entered again, and then the competitions were canceled. Basically, theory and rumor has it that the competitions were canceled because Grand Seiko was going to win, and the Swiss didn't want a Japanese brand beating out all the other Swiss ones. Basically, Grand Seiko in the same year also entered their watches into a similar observatory trial in Geneva, and they placed between 4th and 10th place for their Grand Seiko models. And the only reason they didn't get 1st, 2nd, and 3rd is because those were all Swiss-made quartz watches, while 4th through 10th were all Japanese Grand Seiko mechanical watches. So although they had amazing accuracy, which at the time was plus minus 2 seconds per day, the quartz watches still beat it out. Their most prolific examples from those kind of showcase from the observatory trials were later known as the very fine adjusted Grand Seiko calibers, VFA for short, and they were just very high accuracy, high beat movements. So moving on to something a little more relevant to today's review, because I have a quartz watch. Grand Seiko released their first quartz watch in 1988. This was a quartz watch that featured their own quartz crystal that was Grand Seiko grown. And the reason they pretty much do that is they want to ensure the purity of the crystal, that it actually oscillates at the correct frequency. In 1993, they wanted to improve on that system. So they created they improved in 4 different areas that are also present in today's model. And of course, those aren't Grand Seiko's only achievements. I mean, they worked on spring drive for over 20 years, and then by the time that it was actually unveiled, they only put it in Seiko models because they didn't want to use it in Grand Seiko until they can reach a 72-hour power reserve, because that's what their standard was, and it took them years and years and years to get to that 72-hour power reserve. But Grand Seiko as a brand, as I think you'll see in the review, or hopefully I can try to make that shine through, is that they definitely make well-made watches. They care about their watches, and there's a lot of detailed, orientation, which not a lot of the brands, at least at this price point, execute so well, I guess. So let's get into this one. Let's take some dimensions. We have a diameter of about 96.8. We have a lug to lug of about 43.8, and we have a height of 9.8 with the lion, which is slightly raised from the case back, and 9.5 without the lion. So we have 19mm lugs, which kind of sucks, but there's definitely more options for 19mm than there used to be. We have Barton making 19mm straps in both their canvas, silicone, elite silicone, and possibly their alligator range, but I'm not too interested in their alligator range. We have Crown and Buckle, which does the 19mm chevron, and we have Vario, which does 19mm leather Hermes style straps. So got a pretty decent amount of options. Some specifications of the watch really quick. We have the Quartz 9F62 movement. This is a Quartz watch, and it retails for $2,200 new. It runs at plus minus 10 seconds a year. An average Quartz watch is closer to about 10 seconds a month, give or take, which is a closer figure to 3 minutes per year instead of 10 seconds per year. This watch movement is actually thermocompensated, which means it can resist extremes in temperature, which would normally affect the timekeeping of a Quartz watch. It has a super sealed cabin where all the more mechanical components are in, such as the 9 jewels that this movement does have. And because of that, that means the cabin is airtight and the lubrication stays more consistent, and therefore it has a 50-year service interval. The movement is entirely assembled by hand by 2 watchmakers who work on specific different parts of the watch movement, and it also measures the temperature 540 times a day and adjusts the timing if necessary to make sure it reaches that plus minus 10 seconds a year accuracy. And it's also water resistant to 100 meters, but sadly there's no screw down crown here. So moving on to the dial of this watch. As we can see, it is by pretty much most standards and measurements a very plain dial. We have a flat black dial. We actually have the benefit of applied and multifaceted markers, which are brushed on the sides, not brushed, polished on the sides, and brushed along the tops of the markers. As you can see with those Dauphine style hands, they are brushed in the middle portions and polished along the edges. We have just a simple GS logo with the Grand Seiko written underneath. Some people think it would be nice if you added something to the empty space here, because it usually used to be Seiko Grand Seiko there, so there was a more balance between it. But honestly, when you have a collection and you have a watch like this, I think it gives it something to differentiate itself from the rest of the pack. So it's not something that bothers me too much, but it is a note that some people take. Yeah, overall, very simple dial. It obviously does shine, catch the light very well. The markers definitely play around. But let's go on a macro level so I can actually show you kind of more about what's special about this watch. Each of those markers have this cool pattern to the top where it's literally a bunch of vertical lines coming down, creating this very cool pattern that plays with the light very nicely. As you can see, we have that applied Grand Seiko there. The markers are very nicely raised off the dial, giving a little dimensionality. You can see that the Grand Seiko lettering is actually done in this kind of silvery print, which is matched in the hour indices here, which is actually pretty cool. A nice little attention to detail that they really didn't have to do, but they did do anyway. If you take a look at the hands, we see again the very nicely finely brushed middle section with the very high polished, almost seeming like they're not there sometimes, flanks of the hour hand and the minute hand, of course. A nicely framed date window. Overall, just very nicely done and clean dial. Again, we have those really cool striations. Is it perfect? No, there's little imperfections. There's kind of either specks of dirt or just tiny unfinished parts on that top marker, as you can see. But really, overall, it's very nicely done, and you have to keep in mind all the components on this watch, or at least all these brushed and polished components, are hand finished. So when something is done by hand, it is done to a great and very fine degree, but it may not always come out perfect, but man, does this look pretty good. Moving on to the case of this watch, it is very, again, simple but effective. It has nicely brushed top lugs, which are actually polished on both sides, as you can see kind of better in this very top lug there. You got it flanked by those 2 polishing sides, which actually pretty much slims it down, at least visually, from the top of the wrist, and allows it to seem even more elegant than it is, I guess.
As you can see, the case is very straight along the mid case here and then sharply turns down to allow itself to curve more to the wrist. The lug ends actually do come below the case back, which allows it to sit very, very well onto the wrist. You can see we have that very nicely done Grand Seiko crown, signed with the kind of matted background and lovely polished logo. Pretty good knurling on the crown. I mean, you're not going to be winding it every day, so it's not something you necessarily have to be in love with. I do like how well it integrates into the case. You don't really see any gap between it, which is good because technically it has 100 meters of water resistance. I don't trust it if it's not a screw down crown, but you know, it's there. You can see that we have this all brushed bracelet, which has my fingerprints on it, but all brushed bracelet, and it tapers from 19 to 18. So there's not really much of a taper, but it's just a gentle, slight taper. It allows it to be a little beefier since it kind of almost stays the same length the whole way, giving it more of like a sporty vibe. A very nicely done emblazoned Grand Seiko clasp. We see again mirroring the crown, we have the matted background with the polished logo. Is a push button deployant clasp, nicely milled. If you get a look at the back there, we have a nicely emblazoned Grand Seiko lion. Very cool, almost sparkly background, kind of almost mirroring the numerals and the minute markers on the dial. One thing about the clasp is it doesn't have micro adjustment, which I wish it did. It does have half links and full links, so you can kind of adjust it to where it fits pretty well. Very nice profile, very just the way the polishing shines and shimmers and just how clear of an image, as you can see that the polishing just shines through and just pretty much mirrors everything. But yeah, let's go into how it wears. So earlier I was wearing my vintage Rolex. So here we have the watch on my 6.5 inch wrist, and as you can see it looks very proportional, I would say. It is a slimmer, about 37 millimeter case. It has a very modest lug to lug width. It does have these male end links, which effectively do increase the stance on the wrist, but even then it still does fit in very well. You can see there, it really does conform to the wrist. Looks really good, feels very comfortable. Wears again very slimly, very close to the wrist. Definitely does feel like a quality bracelet, quality construction, the way that it just, I mean, this watch just shines. It literally shines unlike really any other watch I've ever had. Like if I, again, bring in this Rolex here, I mean, of course it's not a modern watch and it's not a Grand Seiko, and it obviously wasn't expensive as this Grand Seiko was. It still does not have quite the same shine and shimmer that the Grand Seiko does have.
The pros of this watch, undoubtedly Zaratsu finishing. I mean, I don't think perfectly I was able to capture it in a video, and not everything will shine across completely unless you're like Horology House or something. But the way that it reflects light, it catches light, the perfection of the reflected image, it isn't just a marketing tactic or a gimmick. It actually provides just almost a shinier appearance to the watch in general, because obviously, I mean, yeah, it's polished to a greater standard, yes, but it's also just the way it reflects when you take pictures, the way it catches light, and even very low light settings. It just elevates the watch's feel, the watch's appearance, and it is something that I think does really make a difference. The size of the watch I really like. It's a 37 millimeter watches. Grand Seiko doesn't do a lot of smaller watches. They have a couple at 37, a couple at 39, but a lot of them are in that 40, 41, 44, millimeter range. And although their cases are ergonomic, some of the materials they use, like titanium on the Snowflake, make it wear very well. I just prefer a smaller watch. So the 37 millimeter fits me well, and I think that it would fit a variety of smaller wrists well. The other main benefit of it is it's quartz. It is also Grand Seiko quartz, so it has amazing accuracy. It's plus or minus 10 seconds a year. Other than that, I mean, it really does feel like it's a quality watch. The metal again, shines. The weight of it, even though that's not always a great indication because you have things like titanium, it feels sturdy. The bracelet's well made, articulated. It's nice. So to the cons, for some people, quartz will be a con. I bought this watch. It wasn't cheap. It's the most expensive watch I've purchased to date, and I was fine with it being quartz. It's very accurate. The tick is defined. It hits all the markers. It's easy to grab and go. I don't need to set the date, set the time. It's convenient. And it still has all the quality of a luxury watch. It has the Zaratsu finishing. It has the well-built nature. It has the warranty. It has hand finishing. It shines. It looks like a good watch from the wrist. But some people just can't get over that tick, and that's completely fine. Other cons, I mean, again, as I mentioned, the price, spending $2,000 on a quartz watch, some people will never be able to fathom that. And that's okay. I mean, if you spend, I think, $3,000, $3,500, don't quote me completely, but you can get an automatic watch. You can get probably one of their lower end spring drives without a see-through case back, of course. But, it is at the lower end of their spectrum. It is their entryway into the brand. So it's up to you what you like. One of the main pet peeves that I actually do have with the watch is there's no micro adjustment. I mean, you're on the clasp, it is possibly going to be too loose, too tight. You take out a half link, it's still too loose, too tight. So, I mean, if they would have added micro adjustment, and the clasp is very, very small, or at least the visible portion of it on the outside, they definitely have room to add it. And I think it would improve the wearability, the comfort of it, the appeal of their bracelets a lot more. So that's something that I think would be really a good addition. And overall, some might find the watch plain. It's not flashy, it's not a sports watch. Well, I mean, I guess you could use it as a sports watch, but you know what I mean? It doesn't have a bezel, it doesn't have texture, it doesn't have a funky color. It is a black dial, 37 millimeters, so on the smaller side watch. And some people may get bored of the design. Some people may have nothing that's drawing them to it in such a way that they're like, wow, that's so cool. But I think when it's on the wrist, when you have it in these certain lighting situations, it does look really cool. But, I'm biased. I bought the watch. I like it. But, yeah, that's my review of the watch. I hope you liked it. And I'll see you again in another one, hopefully. Thanks.